Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, the man who puts the really into Stephen Sondheim. As in, Mayor Really, we roll along. Well, actually, we will be touching on one of the works by Stephen Sondheim in today's episode. It's the one that you can't see for the trees. But that's just one of a number of shows that we'll be tackling today, because it was my great pleasure when I was at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year to sit down for an extended conversation with an old friend of this programme and, if I now may say, an old friend of mine, Michael Gordon Shapiro, the noted film and games composer and, of course, writer of a number of musicals, of which we may hear a little example later on. Now, as Mike himself has said on the record, one of the reasons he started coming to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, last year as it happens for the first time, was because of the enthusiasm that we here on Musical Talk had for it. And it proved not to be wrong, because when he came over last year he loved it so much that he came back again this year, and I hope that's going to be a tradition that we see for many, many more years to come. Because Mike is always someone worth talking to. And to prove it, I'm going to ask you to listen to a conversation I had with him. So, as Shakespeare would say, without further ado and not a lot of trouble, let's get on with the episode. I hope you enjoyed this first half of an extended conversation with the peerless Michael Gordon Shapiro. Musical Talk. Mike, it's a genuine pleasure to see you here in Edinburgh again. This is starting to feel like a tradition. It certainly feels like a fine friendship, if I may say. I think you're someone who brings insight, and a unique insight, in fact, perhaps, from your creativity point of view, to shows here in Edinburgh. And I know that you try to mop up as many as you can. And between us, we've seen many, both together and apart. But today we're going to be talking about some of the ones that have tickled our imagination and our fancy. Some we've seen together and some we haven't.
Indeed, and by the way, for you listening at home, you're not aware of this, but I'm blushing right now.
Yes, radio blush.
Exactly.
So we've seen a whole number of shows, some of which have been right up there as five-star shows. We've seen one or two shows which are eccentric in the extreme and we probably won't be touching on, or may do so glibly in passing. But I think we should start with the positives. And this year feels to me, although the average is always you're going to see good, bad and indifferent, I have seen a jolly good number of jolly good shows. Is that the same sense that you're getting?
There's always a spread. There are a couple of true standouts. There are a number of reasonably entertaining pieces. There are a few flawed gems, and there are a few well-intended pieces with terrible missteps. You get the whole range of quality at Edinburgh Fringe.
All human life is here. All show business life is here.
Exactly right.
Well, let's talk about a show we both were very much taken by, and that's Buried, the musical. It's a new musical. I've had an opportunity to interview the writer and composer of it, the people behind it, and so in a future episode of Musical Talk we'll be able to hear in more depth about the creative aspects of how it came to be, but it seemed to land in front of us, I thought, pretty much fully formed as, well, in my view, a five-star show. I liked every second of it. If I was asking you to describe it, how would you do so?
The premise of this show, I think, is its greatest asset, and that is two serial killers whose MO is to take dates presumably met through Tinder or equivalent dating apps, to take them back home and actually murder them. That's their methodology. Yes. And they end up on a date with one another. And they go through a process of mutual discovery and then decision about what are the implications about meeting a mirror image soul for the first time. Do we try to kill each other? Do we develop a relationship? What exactly happens? So the starting point of the show, which is revealed fairly soon, is very smart, very fun, and deftly presented through some great performances.
I like the opening number of this because I thought very quickly that you could see that this was going to be a good show. I liked the way that the opening number, which is set in a restaurant, and we meet the female protagonist, female murderer, I suppose, but we don't know that yet. We just meet someone and she is singing about she doesn't know who's going to come in through the door. You just never know who's coming in next. And so the audience very quickly realises it's a blind date. I suppose what I like is the unwrapping of the Easter egg. There's layer after layer after layer.
Not that that's how Easter eggs are wrapped, but you get the idea.
They could be.
Yes.
Yeah, she talks about taking people home, so we're naturally assuming she's overly eager in the dating process, which is a fairly pedestrian and common thing.
But then they wrong-foot you rather splendidly, I think, because the first date turns up and he's an appalling, self-aggrandizing bore. He's a banker and he's dreadful. And in fact, she actually says, sotto voce to the audience, he's a wanker, not a positive term, although it does rhyme with banker, so it's a handy lyric. And so you're very suddenly surprised when she then puts her hand out to lead him home. And you think, well, hang on a minute, it's made very plain that she cannot abide him. So why is she proposing to abide with him? And then we meet the next date. The resolution to how the date works is not yet revealed until she's met 3 people. 2 are dates and one is a waiter who just happens to be a witness.
Towards the end of the song,
yeah.
I think, is when that punchline lands.
But it's the fact that the waiter gets caught up in it as well, and you think, well, she didn't date the waiter. And as you realise that they're all people, it's revealed that they're poisoned one by one, or at the same time, as it were. The waiter is also done because he's presumably the witness to is the one person who can lead back to it. But I like that the journey of that song, which can only be about 4 or 5 minutes, takes you, the audience, step by step to the premise of the show, but doesn't land it on you in one go. I really like the fact that you think, oh, I know what this is. Oh, that's a bit strange. Oh, that's a bit strange. Oh, that was the sort of the journey I had. And I think if you can do that in one song, you've actually already imparted a great deal of information about the characters we're working with and something about the writers, which I think is a cleverness. I thought it was very clever. I also thought its hallmark in terms of tone was wit, because the subject matter gets progressively darker, and then we reach a nexus point, which I don't think we should reveal, but it does relate to the principal job that murderers do, their CV.
Exactly right.
So as the show gets darker, it is the wit which leavens it, I suppose, in a way, and keeps us engaged. I mean, what were your emotional responses to? I'm asking for emotional responses because I'm very interested about how an audience empathises or sympathises with 2 protagonists who are not just figurative murderers, but people we actually see murdering.
Literal murders. I think the lesson of Sweeney Todd was we can emotionally connect to a fictional murderer if we are given reason to. And the challenge is finding some common ground between killers and ourselves. And
yes.
Presumably we've all wanted to kill somebody, but taking that extra step is usually beyond the pale.
When did you start feeling these feelings, Mr. Shapiro?
As I sat down here today, of course. No. So yes, the question is, how do you like a murderer? Even if they're singing, that doesn't mean we're going to jump that gap and take their perspective as our own. And the way this is accomplished here, I'll try to be oblique and I'll give a little bit of plot development information while trying not to spoil anything major, is that the 2 enter a kind of collaborative relationship that has some elements of a traditional romantic relationship. And as they're going about their business, they embody a lot of the habits that you would see in traditional couplehoods. Yes. They watch TV together. They just happen to be watching documentaries on serial killers and critiquing them for realism. They're squabbling about logistics. They're doing all the kinds of things you would expect in a pedestrian relationship. And the juxtaposition of those petty conflicts and those moments of bonding and togetherness with the grim reality of what they're doing is very, very funny. And it humanizes them in a way that I think is essential for a show if we are to emotionally bond to the protagonists.
I think that's very fair, because you do. There's 2 of them, a man and a woman. He's called Harry and she's called Rose. They more or less declare themselves to be sociopaths or indeed psychopaths. And then they ask the question, is it possible for psychopaths to have relationships? And although they do it obliquely, they notice that that's what comes up on Google. And as you say, the trappings, it's really a parallel to a standard relationship or a mirrored version of a standard relationship. But it's got some lovely tweaks, because whereas a real relationship comes up with a traditional story for a couple is, how did we meet? And then you incessantly tell everyone about it until they're blue in the face with boredom. They have to invent a background story in order to create some kind of truthful looking background to how they came to be. They didn't, because obviously the actual story, we tried to mutually murder each other, is not going to cut the mustard in society.
And the process of exploring possible backstories is musicalized. So it's made very vivid and interesting. And seeing them debate possible origin details and accepting some and actually reenacting these pedestrian scenes is very, very funny.
There's 2 things about it I like particularly, because you were talking about how it does end up mirroring, or in fact almost being, a relationship. And indeed it is a relationship, actually. It's a collaboration. I think it's the very splendid word you used. Harry is prone to ad-libbing, where Rose is not. And that's already a difference in their relationship, because obviously everyone is slightly different. They're not the same, as becomes clearly apparent as the play progresses. And that's exactly true of every relationship. There are little rubs, and they argue about their lies. That's the interesting thing about it. You know, you're lying too much, or you're lying in an ad lib kind of a way, and I have to make sure that the lies are standard, otherwise we'll be caught out. So there's that little squabble. There's also the beautiful directorial touches, actually, I thought, because they're trying to work out if they met on a train, or a plane, or at a wedding, or a party. And there's just 2 seats on the stage. And to represent a train, as they try and rework through how they might have met, they put the seats together as you would on a train. No, they sit opposite each other for a train, and they sit next to each other for the aeroplane. So they're just 2 simple seats. They sort of, I think, very deftly sketch, in visual terms for the audience actually, the environment in which they may have met if that had been a truthful representation. I also like the fact their relationship, therefore, has to be immediately retrospectively looking rather than forward-looking, which is what you would expect a relationship. When people get together, they start talking about marriage and future and things like that. Right. Their first discussion is, what fabrications are we going to create for our not-at-all-together past? There's so much little wit. I like it.
The nuances and especially the performances really keep you engaged the entire time. There are very few moments that feel slow or where the momentum has been lost. It's also interesting to see what aspects of a show like this cause our emotional connection with protagonists. They both murderers give us elaborate backstories of whatever childhood influences push them down that path. And I imagine that's done just so we understand a little bit more about them. But what's interesting is all the discussion of their past is not what connects us to them, but instead these very common expressions of vulnerability and need for one another, which are shown to us during the course of the show. And that's what really drags us in. The backstories are almost unnecessary. Intellectually, we want to know why they became this way, but emotionally, we don't need to know that. And it's the storytelling itself that really makes us connect to them as characters.
And yet, it's a very odd collaboration stroke relationship, isn't it? Because they constantly refer to meeting someone else with their mind. It's obviously there is a sexual attraction. That's all made fairly obvious fairly quickly. Certainly, Harry feels something sexually to Rose. He's very keen. Well, she suggests he takes his top off, and he does, to reveal a vest. I'm always a fan of a vest as an undergarment. So he thinks he's speech marked up for it. I think that's on the night they first meet each other and try and murder each other. So there are some interesting sexual frisson going on there, though it doesn't actually result in them sleeping with each other. But it's the narcissism of their relationships as well. They do see something in each other, but what they see in each other is themselves. And I find that fascinating as well. That doesn't actually ameliorate our connection with them. But if you looked at in the cold, hard light of day, it's not a very attractive form of relationship. They very rarely complement each other on anything other than their similarity to themselves.
There are 2 possible views of that. One is you can interpret it as narcissism, and indeed they are self-identified sociopaths, so they're not taking other people's perspectives into account on a daily basis. On the other hand, a slightly more romantic interpretation, in both senses of the word, is that they have been alone for so long. They've been unable to connect to humanity, because they're murdering humanity, but they need of a peer or a kindred spirit is a big element of normal romantic relationships. Yes. So to see them let down their guard progressively is an interesting form of growth, and I think it's very touching.
Oh, that's interesting, because you're looking at it in the wider sociological sense, which is, their rejection of society, yet their need for society, but the society they need is the society that they create themselves. Once again, it's in their own image, but I don't know, we could play this game forever, couldn't we?
So much more eloquently put than I ever could. But yes.
No, I don't think so at all, but I do think we're thrusting towards the same position, faintly at least.
Stabbing forwards, if you will.
Now, but once again, you mentioned something earlier which I thought was absolutely fascinating. How far are we as an audience able to connect with them? So we say it gets darker, and it is clear that murdering will take place, and murdering does take place. We see a succession of murders, and it is how that succession takes place which then causes the denouement at the end, or the dynamic for the denouement at the end. But I want to talk about the murders. We're encouraged as an audience, the way it's written, to find them light, until we're suddenly pushed over the cliff and we find ourselves at a position where the audience can't find it light anymore. So there are sort of, how does the piece suggest that there are throwaway lives? Which is actually sort of what it does suggest, in a sense. I appreciate it has set the tone at a heightened, comic, witty, this isn't real, is it quite wink environment. It's also not indiscriminate. They pick people and they reject people for their murdering purposes. So we are actually privy. It's not even bland, arbitrary, random murder. Although there's an element of randomness, it is the people they meet, but they do select them. Which means that as they progress and they are selecting darker and darker options, that is a choice and not just because they pick the next person who comes along. I find that path and the fact that the audience is led so far down it but no further, or there's a point where the audience rejects, not the piece, but what's going on, which is parallel to a degree on stage, but no further than that. That, I thought, was the most interesting aspect of it. It's the journey of the audience I find almost more interesting than the piece, although the piece is absolutely fascinating.
A show like this walks a fine line because on one hand, as you say, murder is used for comic effect, and the level of realism in the show is dialed back so that we can laugh at people being killed and we can laugh about petty squabbles about whether this person is a good target or that. The danger is if we're too casual about murder in a show, then we lose all sense of stakes and consequences and we stop connecting to the protagonists. And I think a good example of a show that fell prey to this problem is Book of Mormon, which has an incidental character die on stage, shot in the head. And as soon as that happened, I freaked out. I mean, I was in the theater and my blood went cold and I thought, that's really disturbing. I don't mean that I became angry in any way,
no.
but it took me out of the show. It was too dark.
Handbrake Turn.
I haven't heard that before, but yes. Handbrake Turn, I like that. So you have to be very careful, and I think Barry does a great job in walking that fine line, in allowing us to laugh at murder and understanding that this is larger than life. We're not supposed to interpret these murders the way we would a real murder, but at the same time, eventually arriving at a point where there are consequences. I think it's a little bit like the tradition of gangster movies, where we laugh along with gangsters and their rise to power, and they're mowing down their enemies, and they're making
the one-liners.
Exactly right. And then at some point, the tables turn against gangsters, movies like Bugsy, etc. And then we say, okay, well, there are consequences to your actions. So there's a kind of parallel here.
I just wanted to pick up something you said there. I think we should clarify, although it is a heightened show, and it is that slight level that it pitches itself, which is above the normal, I think we should say that the central characters play themselves very normal within the world they're playing. There's no mugging of the characters at all. They are playing it with pseudo-realism or actual realism within the characters themselves. I think some of the characters they meet help add to the heightenedness. There's a group of supporting characters who play all the other people, most of whom, not all, but most of whom are quite amusing or have some such obvious flaws, and everything is telegraphed to us that we need to know about these cameos as they come on, very adroitly, actually, to use the word that you use.
The supporting characters are typically portrayed as vapid, trivial, chatterboxes. Kind of, they're caricatures of everyday people,
which makes them funny, of course.
Which makes them funny, but it also portrays the world as seen by our protagonists. The sort of contempt for everyday life.
I'm real and they're cartoons.
Exactly,
and therefore can be thrown away. Yes.
And I think that helps smoothen the journey to watching them become corpses.
Got to ask you a question. I think you're ideally suited to answer this, if you can. I've had the privilege of talking to the writers about this, and they said the show has an amazing following amongst American audience members here, some of whom have come back again and again, and they said there seems to be a particular taste. I mean, obviously it's self-selecting, the people who are here in Edinburgh, but they said there seems to be a particular taste for Americans in this. Can you identify why that would be the case?
It's tricky. I can only introspect and say that I thought the premise was brilliant. The execution, the performance was very appealing, full of nuance and a lot of humorous detail that worked well with the dialogue. I have trouble generalizing for my countrymen. So
yes, and it's unfair of me to ask. The parallel I wondered might be the case is that, and you must tell me that this is no longer the case or never was the case, and it's just a false truism, if such a thing could be said to exist, which has come over the Atlantic to us, because no one likes to hear more about how they're perceived by other people than the people who are being perceived or misperceived. That's a long sentence. There is the speech marks British love of murder, which is referenced in Curtains, and then of course is it How to Succeed at Murder, or which is the stage adaptation which never made it to Britain, but is Kind Hearts and Coronets in this country, which is about the Gascoignes, I think it is, who basically the chap who wants to inherit the family title, so he murders his way through the family, all of whom are played by the same person. It was on Broadway a couple of years ago and was a big success in a pseudo Gilbert and Sullivan style, I understand. I just wondered that there does seem to be at least a trope of speech marks comic British murder, which plays, I think, more profoundly in America than it does in Britain, because I'm not sure we recognise it so much here.
interesting. I'm now thinking of a similarity to A Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder.
That's the show I'm thinking of.
Oh, okay, so you do. So
Yes.
there is.
It's based on an Ealing comedy called Kind Hearts and Coronets.
And you're saying that has not yet made its way to.
No, it's not come to Britain at all. We don't get any of the good stuff.
I can say it was very popular, but it's hard for me to make a cross-cultural generalization.
You've had 400 years of Shrek, and the last time How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying came over from Broadway, I think it was 1969 or something ridiculous. Anyway, there we are, by the by. Anyway, forgive me for asking, I just wondered if there was any thoughts you had on that.
I'm not saying there isn't an observation to be made there. I'm just not smart enough
You're
to
not
make
the one to make
exactly
it.
right.
I don't think smart has anything to do with it. And you're also right to eschew the opportunity to generalise on behalf of all Americans. I think, and it would be foolish of me to ask you, so I apologise and I withdraw it immediately. Taking us back then to Buried, what did you think of the score? And indeed the lyrics. Let's marry them together.
The lyrics, to my memory, were very adept. They were funny. I have a mixed mind of the score. Musically, it's very appealing. I'm not convinced it was the ideal musical language for this particular story. And it's difficult to talk about music unless we play excerpts. But I'll say, in very general terms, it appeared to be a kind of hybridization of jazz and folk music. And my personal subjective take, with which you may or may not agree, is that the upbeat moments felt a little too bouncy and uniform for a show this witty and dark. And the lyrical moments felt a little bit too casual and jazzy for me personally. So that there was a kind of lulling quality to some of the moments in the score. And the songs were often very reflective and introspective, where I felt they could have been a little more involved in the story, with the exception of the opening number, which I agree with you there that was a very good example of musical storytelling. There were definitely one or two other moments, but as the show went on, I was hearing a lot of internal monologue and reflection and kind of passive songs, and I'm a fan of active storytelling in music. So both the style of music and its deployment sometimes rubbed against what I thought was a very strong book.
You see, that's very interesting. I'm going to, and you were quite right to add your caveats, that it's a subjective view. I don't disagree with you per se, but I think when a show is actually really about psychology and psychologies, specific and general, then I actually think that it can be excused much more than the average show, if such a thing can be said to exist, internal monologue songs or lyrical introspections, particularly in characters who, historically, I think, in theatre and certainly in popular culture, and indeed the tabloids, are not allowed to have any kind of, if you're a psychopath, that's it, you're painted with psychopath colour and you're allowed no black and white or grey. And I think this show did, because I think the huge success of this show is delineating the two psychopaths to show that the psychopathy of the two of them was different, or went less far in one case, which ultimately helped create the dynamic ending that we got. I'm going to say my only mild concern with the piece as a whole is the ending, which I'm not going to reveal in any way. But I didn't think it was pat, but I did felt that it perhaps erred on convenient. Although, on the other hand, it was so entirely neat and of a piece that I can absolutely see why it was chosen as a dramatic way out. It's difficult to discuss it without explaining what it is.
Indeed.
Did it work, however?
Speaking equally obliquely,
Yes.
I'll
Sphinx-like colleague?
Exactly. Put on my best poker face. Here I'll swap with you, and I'll become the show's defender. I thought the ending felt very logical to me. It felt like this is a place where things can go that feel set up by what we've seen, and it offers a kind of satisfaction. It's neither too goody two-shoes for a show like this, nor is it too bleak and depressing. So we still walk away satisfied, and I feel like I'm treading on eggshells here. I'll leave it at that, so as I don't inadvertently spoil something.
But what we're clearly saying by not spoiling anything is that we both think this is a really very good show. We very much like other people to see it, and we very much like it to go further.
Absolutely. Such critiques as I offer are caveats atop of a strong admiration and just a really positive experience. It's nice to see something both so funny and smart, but also so polished in execution.
I can tell you now that Buried is going to be one of the shows that I will be talking about privately and possibly on the record for a long time. It's one of those shows I'm taking away with me from Edinburgh as one of the best shows I've seen this year. So I'm delighted by it. Shall we move on?
I think it's time. One show I liked tremendously was called Atlantic Scottish Story. And this is one of a pair of thematically similar shows that were written as a collaborative project between two institutions, one American and one Scottish. The American side being Northwestern University and the Scottish contributor being writers at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. Did I pronounce that remotely correctly?
Conservatoire or Conservatoire. Yes, it's perfectly fine.
Strangely French.
Yes, it's the old Scottish Royal Academy of Arts.
The upshot is you have two musicals, one set in Europe, one set in the US, and both having some transatlantic component to them, some element of wanting to travel or needing to travel across the sea. I've only seen one of these two, so it's a little bit hard for me to draw parallels between them, but the one I saw was remarkably strong and had a very powerful emotional takeaway for me, and that's really what I look for in a musical. And this was the Scottish version, the Scottish contribution, the Scottish member of the two. And this was a story set, I believe, around the turn of the 20th century. It doesn't really matter, but I believe that was the setting. And it's on a remote Scottish island, kind of the equivalent of Anatevka from Fiddler on the Roof. It's very provincial. The locals are expected to be local, to marry local, to live on the island.
It's an isolationist existence.
Very much so, and a little more understandably than it would be today when mass communication was much less available as well. There's even a song where the villagers are essentially training the children how to be good islanders. Here's what to look for, here are the plants you need to know, here's how not to get afoul of the perils of our particular island. And there's explicit mention of the fact that their job is one day going to be to give the same speech to the next generation.
So this is, as you said, quite right, from Fiddler on the Roof, this is tradition, but it's practical tradition.
Exactly so, but the theme is similar. It's not so glaringly similar that you would draw that analogy while you're watching the show. Stylistically, it's entirely different, but there's a kind of an intellectual analogy you can draw between the two. And again, this is the backdrop. Yeah. And in the story...
It's the history of blood, isn't it, essentially? By blood, I mean family.
I'm glad you clarified, because I was suddenly discomfited. Exactly so. And it's not necessarily just a family tradition as it is in Fiddler on the Roof. It's a broad cultural tradition. It's a geographical tradition. And in the story, we're introduced to a young woman named Evie, who has a childhood friend / admirer / suitor named Quinn. And Quinn is of the standard archetypical musical theater trope of having his eyes on the horizon. He doesn't want to live on this small island. He aspires to adventure, and specifically across the Atlantic and in the United States. And he declares his intent to go, and he, from the outset, invites Evie to go with him. And I think at childhood, this manifests as kind of a general, I've got my eyes on bigger things than this, part of your world, et cetera, et cetera. Don't want to be part of this provincial life. You could go on with the Disney analogies all day. And at the same time, he has a kind of childhood crush on Evie, which matures into a more traditional romantic relationship.
So they are best friends.
They are initially best friends, but he kind of makes it clear that he's interested in her from the get-go. And as they arrive at an appropriate age, it's clearly more romantic. So at a important juncture, he tells her, I'm going across the Atlantic to the United States, as has always been my dream. It's not a U.S.-specific dream. I just think that's the place to go where you have that aspiration.
And we know it's very much of its time as well, because almost every Titanic story that's ever been told, and of the 727 that there have been, it's all about people trying to find a better life in America.
Exactly so.
And obviously the extra sadness of that being ripped away from them in the most horrible way possible.
Which I'm happy to say does not happen here. So
Hooray!
He tells Evie at a crucial juncture, I think they're 15 or 16 or so, the time has come, I'm leaving, please come with me. And he frames this as wanting her as his sidekick, which is kind of a childhood trope. That's how they describe themselves from childhood. But it's clear that he doesn't mean sidekick, he means partner in every sense. And he's simultaneously making a de facto proposal of sorts. And the premise of this show is, what happens if you turn down that big opportunity? What happens if you decide to stay home and stay behind? And this is described in the literature for the show, so I'm not spoiling anything. This is essentially plot point one. So
but it is a wrench, isn't it?
It's
leave everything you know behind. That's actually a fundamental.
It's a very tough question, especially viewed in real life terms. And this story explores what happens when you turn that down. And Evie decides at a very deliberate choice point, and in song, she says, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to be who I was meant to be. We, the audience, know that she has more opportunities than she is aware of, but she thinks that she's constrained by tradition and duty. So she decides to remain at home. And the show is an exploration of what that means. How do you live your life knowing that you've turned down this opportunity? And rubbing salt in the wounds is the fact that Quinn remains in love with her, and he retains a hope that Evie is going to pack up and join him. So he sends her correspondence very frequently, and we get to see his journey in parallel to Evie's. So we see him going to the United States and making his fortune and having adventures and traveling from place to place, and all the time corresponding back to her.
Making a success of it.
And this is about the threshold of what I will reveal. I will say that she receives she works locally, she gets a job, as do all of her friends and colleagues. She receives a marriage proposal from a good-hearted but unexciting young man. Some parallel to Sunday in the Park with George, I think, where the character marries a baker, but her heart is really on the more exciting creative person.
But everybody loves Louis.
Exactly right. And we stay with her and see the impact of this decision and see how it devastates her. And what are the very real consequences on a day-to-day basis. We see it changing her in ways that feel very real to me. This is about where I want to stop my description of the plot so as not to dig into the meat of the story, but it's very touching. And what I'll say as well is that despite this bleak trajectory, I'm going to be very vague, the show manages to have a very positive and uplifting ending. You would think that we're in for a very naturalistic and depressing story leading to something very devastating at the end, but without sacrificing the meaningfulness of the story, it manages to put a positive spin. And there's neither a whitewashed, I guess this is okay, I suddenly appreciate my hometown and its rocks and its provincial lifestyle. There's no glossing over the reality of this opportunity to climb. But at the same time, there's a positive ending, and I'll leave it at that. And it's very, very touching. I think this is such an important subject, and to have it dealt with from the mirror image of the typical story trajectory, to say what happens if you turn down that big opportunity, if Belle doesn't hop on the magic carpet with Aladdin and so forth, but have it not be just a depressing story of someone falling apart. This is a hard accomplishment, and the show managed to do that, and it's very, very touching.
So it has psychological truth, which not all shows have.
It does.
Sentiment without sentimentality.
Absolutely, but it also has a kind of romantic element to it in the sense of showing us an aspirational view of life. And I'm just impressed that it could do both. Musically speaking, there are both personal song moments and happy villager type numbers of the townsfolk. And
so I'm guessing a folky feel to the whole thing.
There is, but there's also a contemporary musical theater, musical vocabulary that comes in for some of the more personal moments, which is welcome. The song where Evie describes her decision, which is reprised in a very smart way later, is phenomenally powerful. It's the combination of what's happening at that moment and the particular musical choices. The modal folk language is used in a way that feels contemporary, but also tied to the time and place of the story. So I was very impressed by that. I do think there's a bit of an abundance of the happy villager numbers or the tradition-esque numbers and folk tunes, both sides of the Atlantic. The show could have done with a little bit less of that and a little more musical focus on the protagonist and the co-protagonist. But
that's a balance issue, isn't it?
It is. That's a fine-tuning issue. And I just think the fabric of the story and music is very strong. And though there were more polished shows at Fringe, this was my favorite from the standpoint of emotional response, of a show just grabbing you by the heart and not letting go.
You sent me a very positive tweet, a very positive text about it.
I did.
So obviously I could detect your excitement from afar.
My emotions are not hard to read, as you may remember from our conversation last year. My facial expression changes, and I get very involved when I'm enthusiastic about the show. So,
but there's a parallel show, isn't there? It's Atlantic, the American story. Are we to assume that is the story of Quinn? Or is it an unrelated story only connected by the travelation?
I believe the latter is the case. I haven't seen it, so I'm not an authority, but I'm pretty sure it was written by different authors who were, I suspect, tasked with exploring this general subject, but coming about it their own way. So I think the stories may coexist in time, but I don't think there's more overlap between them than that. I could be wrong.
But you'd certainly recommend it?
Well, I'd recommend the Scottish one from first-hand experience, and if opportunity arises, I'd say, given the strength of one of the two offerings, why not see the other as well?
Well, the Royal Scottish Conservatoire always puts on a good show, I must say. Their selection has been very curious over the last few years. I've had this conversation with someone else, but 10 years ago, when I first started coming to the Fringe, they made it their point of always premiering in Scotland, in Scottish Premier terms, a big Sondheim. So we had Sunday in the Park with George, and I remember a company, quite a slow-paced company, but it was a very good one. And then suddenly they decided that there possibly wasn't enough Sondheim to go round, so they sort of veered off. And they've been getting increasingly either adventurous or B, commercial, depending on how you want to look at it. Because for the last few years we've had Urinetown and 9 to 5. And whilst they are throwaway enjoyable, they are throwaway. Sorry, Dolly, I don't know how to tell you this, you're not Stephen Sondheim. So there's been some interesting stuff over the last few years, but it was a delight to me to see that they've gone back to their Sondheimian roots, if you like, with Into the Woods this year. Now, the thing about Into the Woods is it's such a known commodity, it's almost impossible to say anything new about it, so I'm not proposing to do so. But I will talk about the production, because they've gone for what I understand is the 2010 revision. Now, the 2010 revision, you may know more about this than I do, is the version which in British terms I suspect is probably going to be best known as the Regent's Park open air version, where they were able to use real trees. So 70 years in the making, if you like. And Dame Judi Dench, I can't even say it, Dame Judi Dench as the giant's wife, voice over only. But what they've tried to do is at least echo what we've always understood to be James Lapine's original idea, which was that the baker's child is the narrator. Because in the original version, the narrator and the wild man are the same person.
And the narrator meets his doom somewhere in the second act as well.
That's right.
A strange and disorienting change of presentation style.
Although that does still occur in this, although the narrator, I noticed, does come back. But yes, they give him to the giant's wife still in this version. But it starts, as the London production did, with a father going through the woods to try and find his runaway son. And it's implied, though never stated, that father is the baker's son later on, having his own problems, and therefore imagining the circumstances, or remembering the circumstances as told to him, of how the woods have had this effect for many years. There's a couple of problems with this. It feels very nice, and everyone says, that would have been better. And that seems to be why it's now standardly incorporated. But the problem with it is, of course, it does suggest an extremely quick move from a feudal society to a 21st century society, because he's wandering around with a pen torch and a rucksack and all-weather clothing.
Interesting.
Which, bearing in mind Dad was wearing a woolen scarf and patched breeches, that's a big change. I can only assume that when the princes inherited the crown, they decided to really modernise with industrialisation took place very quickly, but I'm being flip. So it starts with that, and it ends with that kind of being echoed, just as a kind of after breath. I wouldn't even put it bigger than that. But that's the 2010 revision, and that seems now to be the standard text. There was another thing I noticed in it, which surprised me, which is which song is it? Children Will Listen? It's one of the songs that the witch sings. Apparently there's a set of alternative verses. And she sings the verses I've never heard before, which is where she is singing to the child rather than to the villagers. And I think it might be the Blame song, Before the Last Midnight. I can't now remember, unfortunately, but I remember thinking, I've not heard these lyrics before. And having spoken to the assistant musical director, who was an absolutely charming man, he said he understood them to be an alternative set of lyrics from the 2010, and you can pick and choose the one you want.
Interesting.
I just wondered, I take it you've not seen this version of Into the Woods?
This is the first I've heard of it.
Ah, right. It's the 11:30 performance in the morning, which I think the Atlantic takes place afterwards. It's very accomplished. I can't fault them. They are professional actors. It's their sort of end of study show. So everyone doing it is about to go into the wide world of show business. So it looks sumptuous. It's been beautifully done. It's the full version. You even get an interval, which in Edinburgh terms is unheard of. Well worth seeing. But it is always interesting to me that as a piece, I always thought Into the Woods was pretty good Sondheim. And there is this now revision. I know everyone revises everything forever. No show is ever finished, is it? But actually, I'm not always convinced the changes improve it. And I'm sad to say that I think that the 2010 version is slightly inferior to the original. It's echoing a disposed concept, which was initially attractive, but I think actually doesn't pay off.
Let me ask you a question about this particular production, which hints at my own biases about the source material.
Yes.
One of the challenges in Into the Woods is allowing the audience to, in some way, not hate every single character. Do you think any of the interpretations here made gave you the ability to connect to characters who are morally a little off-center and who often betray one another, and they're kind of narcissistic as they wander through the world trying to achieve their own ends.
Well, that's very interesting. Certainly, I mean, I think that's a deliberate point of the piece, isn't it? That actually we are raised as children to think Jack of Jack and the Beanstalk fame is the hero of the story. But of course, he's a horrible little thief and a murderer. Well, I suppose you can argue it's not actual murder, although it must at least be assisted homicide if you're knocking down a beanstalk that someone's climbing down.
In this case, he's also, in the show, he is essentially a contributor to, he commits an act of war, the reprisals of which are very strong. Yeah. So
he's an imbecile, actually.
He's got a lot to answer for.
Yeah. And Little Red Riding Hood is a glutton, essentially. So you're right, there's lots of unpleasant characters, but actually, I mean, I went to see it with my friend Dave, who is a fan of musical theatre, but by no means an expert. And he had never seen Into the Woods. He'd seen the film. So for him, he wanted to see the stage play, or the musical version, and was impressed by it and delighted by it. And for him, considered it to be one of the best things he's seen in his stay up here in Edinburgh. So that's the layperson's point of view. I don't mean that in any kind of pejorative sense, but it was nice to hear that. And his observation, unprompted by me in every possible way, was the strength of the female characters. Because, oddly, it does that slightly Gilbertian thing, certainly the witch. They all treat her as the fairy tale kind of witch. Witches are bad. But we can see very clearly, although she's got a mean streak, she's the wise one. We may not, it's the difference between good and nice. She's practical. She has an answer. They don't like the answers, and they may be unpalatable to society in general at the time. But actually, she speaks truth to people who are prepared to live in a fantasy land, if that makes any kind of sense within the context of where we're living. The character who I think has emerged over the last 30 years of Into the Woods, gosh, it is 30 years as well, isn't it? Is the baker's wife. The baker's wife has become a much more... In fact, I think during the Bernadette Peters time, you would definitely say that the witch was, of the ensemble, because it's an ensemble piece, the witch is the main character of the ensemble, the one who's more equal than others. I would say that I think the balance has changed. I think the baker's wife is now the role to have. And I've seen Imelda Staunton do it. And as always, she did it marvellously. But your question, which I've been slightly obliquely avoiding, is, do you like the characters? Well, I've never disliked the characters, but I think that's because we immediately... because we know all the characters apart from the baker and his wife, because they're the new fairy tale, I think we're immediately expected to take them at face value, and it's only as they reveal themselves to be, speech marks, human, which is what the piece is about, but actually the scales fall from your eyes. There's very little redemption in the piece. And even the baker's wife is an adulteress in the end, isn't she? And
she receives her comeuppance for it in a very literal fashion.
Absolutely. Maybe it's not so much comeuppance as come down, and bearing in mind the trajectory.
Well done. Yes. Somebody really puts the foot down on her.
Hey! Boom, I like yours better. She may have no soul, but one landed on her. How's that? Awesome. Anyway, we'll stop there. We could do this for hours. She does have a soul, actually. I mean, she's such an appealing character, but massively flawed. They are all massively flawed, but I don't find that works against them. But this is a theme we've been talking about, isn't it? How can you find sympathy in these characters? I don't know. This is a very good question, because I do find them, on the whole, sympathetic. But do I find them sympathetic because they've actually been put through the ringer? There is a very natural human thing to feel sympathy for someone who's suffered. And by the end, the ones who are still alive have, for the most part, all suffered. Sometimes at their own hand, and sometimes because of the circumstances given to them. But I suspect you're not talking about sympathy at the end. You're talking about sympathy during the journey, aren't you?
And there's a subtle distinction between feeling sympathy or empathy for a character and really connecting to them. And we can feel sympathy for someone who's suffered, but we don't as easily bond with them. We don't resonate with them emotionally unless there's something about them that we can identify with. And suffering is such a lowest common denominator among all people that it doesn't take a lot of effort to show somebody suffering in a story.
But is there a visceral undercurrent going on that actually it is rather handily tapping into our childhood appreciation or acceptance, blind acceptance really, of the archetypes offered to us in fairy stories? Because no child ever says, actually, Mummy, I don't like Jack. He's a bit steely. He's a thief. No, I can't. I saw Jack and the Beanstalk in British pantomime year on year, and I still do. And you still cheer for Jack at the end when the fairly innocent giant, I suppose he does eat people, but that's by the by, really. Jack is a horrible character. But as a child, Jack was the hero, and therefore I suppose the moment you meet Jack and you're you recognise him from your childhood, I suppose maybe one is just more forgiving. Maybe one's intellectual capacity for analysis is actually deliberately short-circuited by one's childhood knowledge of the character. Is that possible?
I think the undercutting of warmly remembered tropes from childhood is an interesting idea. I've just always questioned that it should be the substance of a musical. I don't think that's an emotional angle that I particularly treasure. And I think the story goes out of its way to put characters, to set them up in such a way that in order to get by, they have to be at cross purposes. And I think it's a very negative view of the world, and it's not surprising that the characters do have to butt heads continually because of the rules of the world that have been set up under their feet. So that's why I've always felt a bit
under their feet, once again, being very appropriate.
Keep coming back to that. I know it's tempting. It's a big problem. That's why the show has always alienated me. Though I always admire Sondheim's skill as a lyricist, without question. That one always leaves me feeling cold for that reason. It's such a negative view of humankind that, despite its wit, doesn't bring me anywhere I want to be emotionally.
You see, now this is where you and I are going to differ slightly, because I think it flatters its audience intellectually. It fugues the fairy tale stories in a way that seems so perfect and natural that you buy it immediately, and you, the audience, are encouraged to feel very superior because you're understanding what's going on immediately. And as you know, I've said this before, my emotional heat is somewhere around the orbit of Neptune. So I'm always more encouraged by the intellect than I am by the heart. And therefore, I think it's probably speaking to someone like me. I should lay my cards on the table, having said that it's an intellectual treat. It also has a nostalgic value for me, because it came to London in the Phoenix Theatre, I think it was, in '87, with Julia Mackenzie in the witch part. Therefore, the speech marks, and I put your speech marks around it, the star part, the Bernadette Peters role. It wasn't the same production as the American production. It was an independently British production, but it followed hot on the heels of the Broadway one, and was, as far as I can understand, a massive success. I remember it being, I was 17, and it was the time when I was starting to go to London to see shows on my own, because I couldn't always find people who wanted to come and see musical theatre with me. And '87 was a fantastic year for me, because I went to see Into the Woods on my own and loved it, and went to see it again on my own. So it feels like the door into adulthood. I should also just say, in case anyone thinks I've lost my senses, I also went to see the 100th anniversary performance of Rudigor at Sadler's Wells on my own, because I was desperate to see it. So, the musical theatre bug had well and truly enveloped me by this stage. At the time, Into the Woods was the newest thing on the block, and I must say Rudigor wasn't. It was the 100th anniversary, and I felt that I was encompassing 100 years of musical theatre. I'd like to think I still do that. It's just that's a personal note. So I do have warm nostalgic memories, which may make me more warmly appreciative of the piece than other people. But I then go back to my friend Dave, who thought it was the best thing he saw, or certainly one of the best things he saw when he was up here in Edinburgh this year.
Interesting. Well, I can't begrudge anyone of their positive associations. Yeah. There are plenty of musicals which I love, despite intellectually knowing they're terrible.
Excellent. But the Conservatoire, as always, has come up trumps, I think, on several fronts. And I do like what they do, which is one established show and then new writing.
It's a good balance.
Yes, it is. And it's great for their performers and everyone else involved. Well, we'll finish this episode, if I may, Mike, with a show that we saw very recently and together, and both appreciated immensely. Although I think we both went into it knowing nothing about it. And it shoulda be, I'll say that again, it shoulda be new. And it is shoulda, isn't it?
Exactly. That's an Americanism that means should have.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. It makes me shudder to my very core, or shudder as we are. Yeah. Yep. That you were right to wince. People heard that facial expression.
Yeah, I think they could hear it through my voice.
I knew nothing about it. It was it's what I call a punt. I went to see it because it was on, and I thought, well, let's see what this is. And I was delighted by it. Once again, I'm going to give you the difficult task of explaining the plot, because I'm a lazy man.
I guess as new blood, this falls upon me. So this was a local production of a Broadway show from 2015, and it centers around a problematic wedding between
beautifully put,
a Jewish family and a Catholic or Christian family of some.
They refer to as Gentiles, aren't they?
Gentiles,
that's all you need to know for the
right.
purposes of the delineation.
And there's a host of characters, each of whom have their own quirks and issues. The ostensive protagonist is the sister of the bride,
Jenny,
who is the traditional, always a bridesmaid type.
And apparently happy not to be married.
Content in a kind of resigned way.
Yeah.
Kind of, her expectations at the outset have been permanently lowered. There are two feuding sets of parents with their own issues, one of whom seems to be a little more diabolical and scheming, the other whom is neurotic in a way familiar to New York Jewish families.
I'm afraid it's the Jewish mother stereotype, isn't it?
Very much so.
Although beautifully written.
Beautifully written, very, very cunningly performed, and entertainingly so.
Yes.
And a host of troubles that are arising, some fairly pedestrian wedding stuff, logistical problems, and some where the personalities of the various people involved in the show are starting to rub against each other. That's kind of the big picture. The driving plot conflict is where the ex-boyfriend of the bride, who has been unwelcomed at the wedding, understandably so, and has been out of touch with the family for a while, but was clearly beloved by the family.
He is the "it shoulda been you" character.
Exactly right, because we are, in song, presented to the opinion of the bride's parents that he would have been a better match than the current groom. They're
one they wanted.
They take a dim view of the current groom, even though they're accepting him. So he gets wind of the wedding and thinks he's invited and takes it upon himself to intervene. Apparently because he has always nurtured a love for the bride and wants to, a la The Graduate, intervene at the last minute and declare his love. That's what we think is happening at the outset. So he launches himself into an already problematic wedding and creates all kinds of ruckus. So that seems like a pretty good top-level description of what's going on.
I think that's an extremely adept description. I will say it's interesting you go for The Graduate as as a parallel and a flavour. I'm going to go for a very much more obscure British one, I'm afraid. I thought we were going to get a kind of American-feeling adaptation, because it's an American wedding, there's a very amusing British 1930s book called Nice Weather for the Wedding, and it is the trope of a wedding where the former boyfriend of the bride turns up and tries to stop the wedding, and it turns out the bride hasn't got over her emotional response to him, so they do still love each other. Although pleasingly, without ruining I'm ruining the book, but it's been around since the 30s, so if you've missed your chance, this is it, sorry. He doesn't get his way, and she does marry the chap who was intended to be her groom on the day, so she's sort of making do. And then he wanders off at the end feeling heartbroken, but so it's a beautiful book of it not coming right, because actually I think that's as it should be. And I thought that's where we were going to go with this. And then I was very quickly, the song, It Shoulda Been You, is the one where you suddenly realise, oh no, this has pulled the rug from under me a little bit, and I'm quite pleased. So you realise that he wasn't driven off by the family, but we are as an audience, and I'm going to say hoodwinked into thinking that the dynamics and drive of the ex-boyfriend character are one thing, when it turns out, and I should say the whole thing builds up to this wonderful farcical nexus point, which comes about 2/3 of the way in. And then the last third is essentially how that then unravels itself to get itself to a happy ending. You and I were talking off the record about French and British farce concepts. And French farce is one that ends at the end of Act 1 with the House of Cards falling down, and Act 2 is all about rebuilding it, whereas British farce on the whole is about the House of Cards falling down, and then the House of Cards falling down even more, if that's possible, in the second act, till you get chaos at the end. So one is about status quo returning, which is the French, and I think that's what we get here, or at least a status quo is reached.
A kind of equilibrium that was legitimately unexpected. This show is very good at thwarting our expectations and really throwing us for a loop in a way that feels logical, but in most cases, but not all, it's set up by what we've seen. And if there aren't too many places to go with a wedding comedy. You usually think, okay, they're going to get married, they're not going to get married, or maybe there's a fire.
Yes.
But there aren't a tremendous number of options, and they managed to carve out a new set of possibilities in a very original way, by really thinking beyond the bounds of this genre. And it's pleasing to be surprised, especially when you think you know where things are going from the get-go.
So some of the things that we really liked about it, certainly it was a 90-minute show, which was nice, and it didn't outstay its welcome. I would say, structurally, that I think that once the twist/reveal 2/3 of the way in has occurred, then the French farce elements of rebuilding the house in a new design take a little bit of time to get to where they need to get to. That could be trimmed a little bit, but I think that's just a tiny structural issue which could be very easily sorted. I enjoyed the score immensely. We were lucky, I have to say privileged, I think, to have a large Edinburgh band, which you don't see in. It was live music, and there must have been about 10 members of it.
There was a sizable wind section, as you'd find in a modest Broadway pit. There were traditional wind doublers where individual instrumentalists would have a clarinet and an oboe and an array of woodwind instruments, which is a versatility demanded by the expensiveness of performers. And it's rare to see that in Edinburgh, and they took production very seriously here.
And the performers were all pretty solidly good across the board as well. I mean, I've really bought into The Jewish Mother. That Neurosis came across. I also loved, what's the husband called, Melvin?
I don't remember.
No, Murray. He was called Murray. And he was lovely as well. He was a gentle Jewish father, although there's one moment where he has to sort of stand up and take on the circumstances. He's the one who puts the full stop at the end of the twist, as it were, to allow everyone to draw breath and then start working out where they're going to go. So, his moment in the limelight is then, but up to that moment he's a sort of slightly henpecked, slightly adorable father. The Gentile family, I've got no other way of describing them. On the whole, not very nice. And the groom is a bit empty, but he's not there to be anything other than the groom. It's not really his story. But the thing we both noticed was that the story, either incredibly cleverly or slightly missteppingly, hides its central character from view for most of the story. Jenny, the sister, has the opening number, and ultimately it comes to be her story at the end. She's given a number of songs in between. We see that she's in a fairly damaging relationship with her mother, although it's loving. The mother never sees the elder daughter, who's Jenny, as the better daughter. All the appreciation goes to the younger daughter who's getting married. And there's quite a lot of pain. I mean, in fact, Jenny does sing this, I think, quite plaintive song about never being called beautiful and how she would like to be called beautiful. She's a larger lady, and she's never allowed to forget it for a start.
She's constantly flinching in anticipation of criticism from her mom. She says, I think on a couple of occasions, what is it, Mom? Is it my hair? Is it my dress?
Yes, so she anticipates. Yes.
She's been conditioned to expect that kind of criticism.
So she's given these lovely moments. And she is actually a dynamic character in one level, in the sense she's one of the people who makes the wedding go right, in an organisational sense, not as in a resolving the problem issue. There is also a wedding planner who's just a brilliant cameo. Just every time he comes on, you just think, oh, this man's marvellous. He owns the wedding in a very literal sense, even though that is his role as well. But Jenny is not given quite enough meat on the bone, as it were, in terms of the story. It spends so much time dancing around other characters that it's almost difficult to see that she's the central character. In fact, you asked an extremely pertinent question as we came out. Who was the protagonist of that piece?
Whose story is this?
Yes.
Exactly right.
And it's an extremely fair question. I must say, by the way, I thought the actress was phenomenal, and I suspect she added some heft to the part which probably helped make it clearer that it was her story.
No pun intended.
Well, no, I didn't mean that unpleasantly. I mean that in acting chops terms, as they say. But it is she disappears, and then there's this odd, curious ending, which is where they're rebuilding the House of Cards after the twist. She isn't really part of that. She's not a dynamic in making that happen. She is the recipient of the benefit of it taking place. That's what it appears to me. I've rattled on. Do you have any thoughts? How wrong am I?
No, I agree. We're of the same mind of this. Yeah. And before I launch into any critique, I do want to slather the show with some deserved praise.
Oh, yes.
In that it gives us a set of secondary characters, family members, staff members of the wedding venue, and they're all funny. They all have personalities and little moments to shine. Even the catering employees have little personality attributes and mini quests or mini problems. Yes. So no one is left in the dust as a mere supporting pillar. And that means that no matter what's going on, something funny is happening. Yeah. And the humor is nonstop. The show is tight. There's not an ounce of fat on it. Every moment works and clicks, and there's a rhythm to the material, which the performers absolutely ran with and lived up to. So having said all that, having praised the show for its democratization of the spotlight, I'm now going to criticize it for the same reason. And this is exactly what we talked about. I'm going to steal, as I like to do, some thoughts from Stephen Schwartz, who said there are a couple of things a musical needs to succeed. And the first is we need someone to root for. And the second, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, is we need to know what they want. Mm. And it's not clear throughout this show. There are a lot of people that are likable. There are a lot of people who are likable, but we're not always sure whose story it is. Mm. Jenny's presented us to the outset, as you say, and she's poo-pooing the institution of marriage, and that seems like a normal starting point for a heroine who's eventually going to be lured into romance. And yet she disappears for huge swaths of time. She's given very few songs, and some major songs arrive that have nothing to do with her, where she's standing on the sidelines as a cheerleader. So it's a little bit odd, and our instincts are thrown askew. In this case, I don't mean that in a good way. I don't mean that we had this expectation and the rug was pulled out from under us.
It's not a blind.
Correct. It's odd. It's odd to see so much coming from other characters and to have to touch base so infrequently with Jenny. She gives us I would say the bare minimum in musical exposition about what she wants, and it happens awfully late in the day. A musical has to orient us early on to what the protagonist wants. And what they want may change, but we kind of need to be able to track them and say, okay, this person wants X. Elphaba wants to go study with the wizard. I get it. Oh, she changed her mind. She wants to be an activist. Okay, I get that. But we have to follow, I'm going to use a pretentious word. We have to follow their teleology, the suite of goals that they have. Thank you. It's an educational show. We have to know what they want, and we have to feel connected to that, ideally through song, and that's not the case here. She pops up, and she almost seems like a first among equals a lot of the time.
Well, in fact, her very first number is an I Don't Want song, which is very unusual.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
there's no yearning. It's the what I don't want is the following, i.e. a wedding.
She's presented to us as an enthusiast for her sister, and she digs her sister out of an emotional moment. She encourages her. There's a little bit of you the man, no you the man, kind of back and forth dynamic. She clearly wants the wedding to succeed and is annoyed by threats to its success. But her own story doesn't emerge to the end, and I'm not going to reveal what it is, but I didn't feel it was convincing at all, and it felt out of the blue. And for a story that is very realistic for a comedy, in depicting
heightened realism, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. It was a little bit of an unsatisfying ending in that respect.
However, I think you're right to, once again, add your caveats that we like the show, and we like the show a very great deal. I want to talk about the music because it seemed to have a couple of options. It was sub-Sontimian. In fact, the very first number, I told you this off the record as we left yesterday, which was that what I don't want is the wedding. I thought we were basically going to get Getting Married Today from Company writ large, where it actually happens that she doesn't get married. And I thought that was going to be the driver for the plot for the first few minutes. Obviously, that isn't. It very quickly becomes something else. But that song seemed very evocative of Sondheim, not just in content, but actually ever so slightly in feel musically. And there were other Sondheimian moments. There were other songs. I kept getting Into the Woods moments, funnily enough, in fact, there's a reference to being nice as well, which obviously makes one think about, nice is different to good,
right.
And you're so nice, and what really matters is the blame. There's a lot of squabbling and all that kind of stuff. So I was getting witchy resonances from Into the Woods, amongst other things. And then there was this kind of sort of 1920s feel every now and then, mostly for the parents, I think. I think it was used partly to delineate certain generations, but there was essentially sort of rather lovely 1920s pastiche stuff going on. So I like the score immensely. I can't quite work out what direction it's pointing in, but it sounded beautiful.
It was a very polished instance of something that's very familiar, a jazz-driven score with a few whiffs of contemporary harmony, but by and large something of yesteryear. It wasn't inappropriate given the age of most of the characters and the setting. I would have appreciated something a little more adventurous given that the show came out in 2015. There's nothing offensive. The tunes aren't super memorable, but they're all very functional. They're very deftly woven around lyrics and breaks for dialogue, and it all felt cut from the same cloth.
There's no bum notes in the sense of none of them were wrong.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
The lyrics, on the other hand, I thought were tight and sharp and extremely smart, and they showed the utmost of craftsmanship. I was going to say they are what you would expect from a Broadway show, but actually, given recent offerings, they are considerably better than what you might expect from a Broadway show. There was one lyrical moment, and I don't know if it was intentional or not, but I feel the need to describe it because
Please do.
If it was intentional, it was brilliant. There was a line early on that ended with the word shock, and the rhythm of the song was very start and stop, so the point at which we should expect a rhyme wasn't super predeterministic, but there was a moment rhythmically that could have been what we'd expect to be the answer to that line that ended with the word shock, and it was somebody knocking on the door. So the word shock was answered possibly by a literal knock, and it's super subtle, and it wasn't jarring. We weren't set up to expect a rhyme and not hear it. There was another word at the end of another line that ended up being the basis for the literal rhyme. But I heard that, I thought, oh my, did they just do that? That was really smart. And the lyrics were so smart that I'm inclined to think that was intentional.
It'd be lovely to see the actual song sheet, wouldn't it? Wherever it actually does say la 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 brackets door
knocks.
Yes,
exactly right.
That would be fantastic.
But even that moment aside, the lyrics were so smart and so well done. I think almost every rhyme was perfect, but they were unexpected, which is which thwarts the usual danger of perfect rhymes, is that sometimes you fall into Moon June kind of lyrical pairings. And
Spoon!
There were many moments where I just didn't know where the line was going to go. Even if they were setting up a rhyme with a strangely complicated word, I still couldn't predict what was going to be the rhyme partner of that. So hats off to the lyricist who did a phenomenal job.
I'm going to just mention cultural difference because I think we have to. I mean, the wedding is a very American wedding, and forgive me, American weddings are still quite different from traditional British weddings. I'm sure there's huge overlap, but there's also a huge difference. I must tell you, it's a joint Jewish Christian wedding. I don't think we actually work out what the denomination is for the Christians, but the wedding takes place at the end, well, not at the end, about 2/3 of the way in, but we hear a glass smash, and for those of us who are not familiar with Jewish weddings, I thought, that's a dropped glass because something's gone horribly wrong. And then they all shout Mazel Tov. And you suddenly, not Molotov, obviously, that's a very different thing. It's quite, suddenly a riot.
They would also use dropped glass.
Yes, yes, quite, I suppose, yes. And then suddenly, intellectually you think, oh, no, it's a Jewish wedding. Of course, that's what happens at a Jewish wedding. So that was a cultural difference. And forgive me, you and I had a long chat afterwards because you had to explain to me what a panini station is. There was a huge scene about cancelling or not cancelling a panini station, and it just doesn't mean anything to me culturally in Britain. But I'm only mentioning these points flippantly because then there was the cultural aspect. The show is so American, and it's an American show, and the cast were absolutely living the characters they were in to the point where I thought they were an American cast. And then at the very end, as often happens in Edinburgh, one of the cast will talk to you and say, if you like the show, could you tweet about it and tell everyone, please let people come and see it. The best way to do that is let people know about it. And of course she had a broad Scottish accent. And you sat next to me and you went, oh my God, or some equivalent.
My jaw dropped.
Yes.
One of the few times in my life where I was just thrown for a loop. I could not believe that she was not an American actress. So good was her, not only her accent, but the mannerisms.
Mrs.
And
Jenny.
all the little inflections. Yeah, I believe the woman who played Jenny. The whole cast in general did a very good job of, I guess, faking American accents and mannerisms and just taking ownership of the subject matter, which, as you said, could not have been more American.
So, I think for the time being, Mike, I think there's plenty more meat on the bone for us to pick over on the Edinburgh Fringe bone. If that makes any kind of sense.
It does not. Okay.
Excellent. Well, I'll write it down and come up with something better later. But for the moment, I'd like to say, Mike, as always, been an illuminating conversation with you, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Likewise, across the board.
Musical talk. Well, there we are, Mike Shapiro, and we'll be hearing more from him next week as we continue that conversation to cover even more of the interesting shows that we saw at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this summer. But I would be doing Mike a disservice if I didn't let you enjoy some of the music that he's written. He is an extremely accomplished composer. His HMS Headwind, a mini-musical, was actually performed in London only a couple of weeks ago. And if you go online to his website, which is mikemusic.com, you can hear and see a great deal more of his other works. But before you do that, why don't I present one to you? And that's a really good idea. I think I will. So, to finish off this episode of Musical Talk, let's listen to a song called The Final Encounter from his incredibly enjoyable show, Super Sidekick, the Musical. I've heard a lot of songs from this particular show, and I like it immensely. I'd really like it to come to London. It has a book by Gregory Kraft, and the music and lyrics are by Michael Gordon Shapiro himself. And singing on this recording, Hannah Noroth and Mark Lopez. So this is The Final Encounter from Super Sidekick, the Musical. Goodbye.
Once upon a time, there comes a time when the hourglass starts running out of sand. As the villains start approaching victory and almost seem to have the upper hand. Listen hard, you'll hear the distant battle call and the ever louder pounding of the drums. All the signs are pointing to, well, I guess me and you. So put your brave face on, cause here they come. It's the final encounter. It's the last confrontation. It's the call to get clever in a tough situation. It all comes down to this, not a moment to lose. Draw a line in the sand and ignite all the flares. Time to cash in the chips, time to call in the troops and come up with a plan that's much better than theirs. It's the end of the mission. There's no encounters after this one.
little boy, at last your time has come. You have meddled in my plans for far too long. If you've come this way expecting victory, then please allow me to reveal how wrong you are. Every fable has a final chapter. Every drama has a closing act. You've had fun pretending, but I'm sorry playtime's ending. It's the grand finale, or to be exact, it's your final encounter. It's your last confrontation. It's your terminal showdown. An impending cremation. It's the end of the line. It's the part where you lose. Time to cease and desist and conclude your affairs. Tell your loved ones goodbye. Sign your name on your will. Blow us all a last kiss and pronounce any prayers and accept your position. You've no encounters after this one.
This episode of Musical Talk edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2017, except for the song where the copyright remains with Michael Gordon Shapiro. And my thanks to him for allowing me to play this song in this episode. My thanks also go to Mike for doing some incredible work on sound compression and equalisation to make this episode sound as crisp and as clear as it does. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos.
About right.
Yes, I think that's about right. And I'm leaning in.
Very well.
So they'll think I'm dominating, which of course is the last thing I try and do. I thought, and now I've forgotten the thought.
You did at one point have a thought.
Yes, it was in 1978, and I've treasured it.
Good year for thoughts.
You happy with that? Because I do need to change. I need to turn it off so it can not corrupt, and also probably put some new batteries in.
That's wise choice. When I'm doing interviews, even though I'm on a very reliable iPhone, I will stop and then hit record again every 10, 15 minutes or whenever there's a natural gap because I'm so paranoid about losing everything.